Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 character building guide. Hope you're all doing well. It's finally here, we're at the 6th level spells, the most powerful and highest level spells in Baldur's Gate 3. At time of recording, we can only hope, right? 6th level spell slots are an incredibly important resource, because most characters only get one of them every adventuring day, and so whether to cast a 6th level spell for a combat at all, and which one to use, is going to affect your most important resource in a given day, and will have a significant effect not only on that combat or that encounter, but on every combat and every encounter that you face during that day, which, depending on how often you long rest, can be several. This means that it's going to have a massive qualitative effect on how your adventuring day plays out, which 6th level spell you use, and whether you choose to use one at all in a given encounter. So making this decision is going to affect not only the encounter that you cast it in, but also several encounters past that. Before I jump into evaluating the specific spells, I have a couple quick thank yous to give out. I want to say thank you to Liesel Strick for the €2 twice, so €4, Chris Klug for the $10, and Dylan Rooks for becoming a channel member. Thank you so much. As well as several people who renewed their channel memberships, which YouTube's analytics on are broken right now, so I don't have that list in front of me, but once that's fixed, I will thank you properly. Thank you so much, my friends. It really does mean a lot. Before I jump into evaluating specific spells, I want to go over one assumption that I'm making in general when evaluating these spells, as well as the tier lists that I'm using. I imagine we have a few people joining us for the first time for the 6th level spells, so I'll go over this in a little bit more detail than I have sometimes previously. So first off, the assumption that I'm making is that you are not long resting after every single fight. It's certainly possible to do that in Baldur's Gate. There are plenty of camping supplies, and you can long rest and refresh your spell slots after every single fight. I think that's a fairly unusual way to play, and I personally find it fun to try to conserve resources across multiple fights, so I'm generally evaluating these spells for efficiency, but if you do long rest after every fight, then some of the evaluations may change because you have to care less about the efficiency of spell slot usage if you're long resting frequently. I'm also assuming that enemies can sometimes pass saving throws against you. It is possible to get save DCs so high that that's not possible, but once you've accomplished that goal, a spell tier list makes a lot less sense because you just pick whichever has the most debilitating effect. So those are two assumptions that I'm making. As to how I'm judging the spells, in S tier we have spells that are absolutely critical, that every character who has access to these spells will want to take, prepare, learn, prepare, and cast almost every adventuring day. In A tier, we have spells that in previous tier lists I've said you'll use in basically every combat, but in this case it's going to be on most adventuring days, since you have to judge 6th level spells based on whether you use them in multiple combats or whether you want to expend them for one combat in a day rather than use them in every single combat. In B tier, we have spells that are very powerful, usually less impactful than A or S tier spells, but still solid role fillers that are going to be very useful frequently and that you'll often go to because it's the right answer to a problem. In C tier, we have spells that are either used only for specific encounters or used only by very specific character builds, and so those are going to be, most of the time, you won't want to learn or prepare these spells, but for some specific encounters, you may find that they're very useful, or some characters may be built around them or get a lot of specific use out of them. And in D tier, we have spells that you should typically avoid preparing and casting because they are weaker than the other options. I have not included an F tier because I think there are very few spells in the game that are completely useless. And one thing, if there's like one lesson that I would like to impart across this whole thing, it's that optimization is a tool, and you should, if there's a spell that you think is fun and want to cast it, you should cast it because it's fun. And the whole goal here is to have fun. I think that people often feel constrained by the bounds of optimization into making certain choices within narrow, like the best possible choice according to some metric, but the best choice is always the one that you have the most fun with. Optimization is a tool to empower you, to allow you to do the thing that you want to do, not to force you to do a specific thing. If there's one single lesson that I could teach across all of my videos, it would be that. Use these tier lists to have more fun, not to stop yourself from doing something that you want to do. Alright, without any further ado, let's jump in and start talking about the specific spells. Oh wait, actually, sorry, one more piece of further ado. I am recording this after having posted my level 4 and 5 spell slot lists, so I have reviewed community feedback on those. I think there's a couple small changes that I could make as a result of that, but nothing major enough that I really want to go back and revise those lists. One spell I will mention is Evard's Black Tentacles, which it is worth mentioning is not flammable, so you can put a wall of fire on top of it. I could maybe bump it up to C tier from D tier for that, but mostly it's still superseded by Entangle, Grease, and Web, and so on. So generally speaking, I don't think it is worth casting over the lower level spells that do the same thing. But it is worth mentioning that one use case of putting a wall of fire or other flammable damage spell on top of it. Alright, now without any further ado, let's jump into the specific spells. We'll begin with Arcane Gate, which is a spell that I really want to like, honestly, because it's so cool. How it works is you connect 2 points within your sight. So you can choose anywhere that you can see, doesn't matter the distance, and a portal appears at each of those points with a very bad casting interface that makes it hard to tell whether you've actually selected each point before it casts, incidentally. So if you're not on honor mode, save before casting this spell, because sometimes you can accidentally cast the 2 portals right on top of each other. This spell allows any creature to then move between the 2 portals as a free action in any number of times per turn, so it doesn't cost them any movement or actions or anything, and they can move between the 2 portals. You can drop concentration on this spell as well, so you could move your whole party through it and then drop concentration to stop people from following you. The AI pathfinding is actually pretty good with handling this spell and will draw movement through it, so you will not be able to break the AI or anything by forcing it to walk the long way while your party portals through, but you can drop concentration on the spell to stage an escape. This spell is basically there are almost no circumstances, I think, where you would want this spell, even though it is very cool, because Dimension Door at level 4 does much the same thing, and of course Misty Step gives you personal mobility that is wildly more powerful than a concentration-based action spell that forces you to that you can do with Arcane Gate. If you need to move multiple creatures a very long distance, this could be better than Dimension Door, but Dimension Door is already a spell that sees very, very narrow uses, so to bump it up 2 levels and add not that much utility to it really does not serve this spell well. There's one encounter where you have to move some NPCs a long distance for the submarine that this could be useful. Even there, I don't think it's particularly strong, because there's other ways to solve that one that are not as resource intensive. I do think there's a bunch of cool things that you could do with this spell, just because free action movement is kind of fun. So there are some weird corner cases that you can get. For example, if you place one end under a cloud of daggers, you can move your character back and forth between the 2 portals and re-enter the cloud of daggers an infinite number of times, taking damage each time. I think. So if you want to bring your character down to 0 hit points, then that's a way to do it. I'm pretty sure that works. I haven't tested it, but that is possible. You could also, I don't know, jump through, free action drop a bunch of barrels, and then jump back through. So you could teleport across the arena, drop a bunch of explosive barrels, teleport back, and then somehow set those off. I think there's maybe some weird and interesting things you can do with the spell, but none of them are very good. I'm just kind of spitballing here, and at the point where I'm spitballing things like, what if we jump through the spell and jump through the portal and drop a bunch of barrels? You know I'm really scraping the bottom of that barrel. D-tier spell. Blade Barrier. Blade Barrier is a wall spell similar to Wall of Fire or Wall of Stone that we've discussed previously. Most similar to Wall of Fire because it doesn't block enemy movement but does damage. It does 6d10 of slashing damage for an average of 33 damage, which is a frankly sad amount of damage for a spell at this level, but it does double dip. So it does the damage on cast or when entering the spell effect, and then again at the beginning of the creature's turn. So you're going to get 66 average damage, 12d10 average damage out of this spell on your initial cast, because they take the damage when you cast the spell, and then they'll take the damage again at the beginning of their turn. One of the many spells in Baldur's Gate that has inconsistent timing rules. This is with a dexterity save for half and requires your concentration, and the area of the wall is difficult terrain, which makes it slightly harder to leave the wall or pass through it, but not hard enough that any enemies will actually get stuck in it, because it's not wide enough to for the slowed movement to prevent them from leaving it. You'll still need to combine this with another effect if you want to keep enemies in it for multiple turns, or cast it on an immobile enemy. The question basically is this enough damage to justify ever casting this spell as a 6th level concentration spell? 66 average damage on your initial cast of a 6th level spell is just not very good. You can get that much burst damage much more easily from a spell that does not require your concentration. So you really need to be getting multiple turns of damage out of this spell in order to justify it. There are some encounters where that will be possible, and the fact that it doesn't set things on fire, so you can combine this on top of an entangle, does give it a little bit of added utility. I think, in particular, combining this with the entangles that you can get from Summon Nature's Ally, so you'll have like a free entangle, free spike growth, and so on, can give you a bit of extra damage on certain long encounters, and because it does the damage in multiple instances, it's okay at removing Unstoppable, though I think you'd still have rather have Wall of Fire. Generally speaking, I just don't think there's any circumstances where you're going to want the damage out of this spell. It's just not enough damage to justify its cost. Dexterity save is one of the worst to target, so even though it does 66 damage, and that's 66 as in 6/6, not 6d6, as in six-sided dice. I know that can be very confusing. It is still just not that much damage overall when you consider that you're spending a 6th level spell slot on it. I think it's not 0 usage, but generally speaking, I just would avoid preparing and casting this spell D tier. Hey pals, it's me from the future. In between when I first recorded this video and when it's going live on YouTube, Patch 6 dropped, including a lot of major balance changes, and one of the main balance changes that they made is that you can no longer use Twin Spell on Chain Lightning. That's something I talked about extensively in my original evaluation of this spell, so I wanted to re-record this segment so I wasn't talking about something that you can no longer do. Chain Lightning is a pure damage spell available to sorcerers and wizards, and it does 10d8 of lightning damage, and then it forks to up to 3 creatures within range. Now, those 3 enemies within range. It won't hit allies. Those 3 creatures have to be pretty close. The range, of course, this being Baldur's Gate, is not specified anywhere in the description, but I think it's about 10 feet. They need to be actually quite close to the main target in order to get hit by the bolts. Those bolts do full damage, so they are going to, if you hit 4 enemies with it, which is the maximum, it will do 40d8 of lightning damage, which you can then double with the wet condition, because it's lightning damage in Baldur's Gate, up to 80d8 of damage in a single cast of a spell. Obviously, that's an insane amount of damage at the ceiling, but even at the floor of this spell, it's 45 average damage if they're not wet, or 90 average damage to a single enemy if they are, and you'll almost always be able to get at least 2 enemies in this spell. So if you're doing 180 damage with a single cast of a spell, that's often going to one-shot a couple enemies, and my criteria for level 6 spells is either they should give you a massive advantage in multiple encounters throughout a day, or it should just win you by itself a very difficult encounter. If you one-shot 2 or 3 enemies out of a fight, and in Act 3, a lot of enemies have kind of like 90 to or 80 to 120 hit points, so you're kind of on the threshold of one-shotting enemies with this spell if you apply the wet condition first. If you one-shot several enemies with a spell, then it will almost always win you that fight pretty easily, and so this spell definitely fits the criteria of a spell that can just win you an encounter by itself. It is just damage, of course, and that's always a problem, and it has a dex save for half, meaning that you won't always reliably get full damage out of this spell, but the cap on the possible damage you can get out of it is insane. Of course, also, if you're a wizard and get this from a scroll, and therefore don't need 11 actual wizard levels to learn the spell, you can combine this with Tempest Cleric to maximize the lightning damage that you're doing, which is the core combo of the Lightning Lord build that I have posted that you can check out, of course, if you're interested in more of that. And that will allow you to do 80 damage at base, 160 if the enemies are wet, to each enemy that you hit with this spell, for a possible total of 700 and... or no, so that's 160 times 2 is 320, so yeah, a possible total of 640 damage in the kind of best case scenario. Obviously, that's not going to be frequent, but it is also worth noting that because this is a 6th level spell, it is worth investing in maximizing this spell. Normally, I don't like to assume that all enemies are wet, because it does take some setup and it's not resource free or anything, but for this spell you definitely do want to take the time to set up those effects, and so we should evaluate it as though you have tried to make use of your level 6 spell properly. The right way to do that, of course, is to get them wet and then blast them. The jokes write themselves, and if you do that, then you are going to take out almost every enemy that you hit with it. Is this a spell that you are going to use every day or in every encounter? No, I don't believe so, but it is a very powerful effect that will kill a lot of enemies, and it's one of the best ways to just end an encounter before it begins by killing several high health enemies immediately. I would say this is an A tier spell. Not being able to twin it does decrease the effectiveness of this spell for sorcerers especially, and just in general, because you used to be able to double the damage against a single target by twinning it against 2 targets, and then each of them would be hit by the main bolt and the fork. But even absent that, I think it is still an A tier spell that will see a lot of play throughout your adventuring days and will be very effective in a lot of encounters. So you're going to see it in the correct placement throughout the rest of this tier list, but I wanted to redo this recording just because I had mentioned something that is no longer possible. Alright, back to your regularly scheduled programming. Circle of Death. Circle of Death is a spell that, not to be too rude, I honestly have to wonder if someone actually read this spell before shipping it in Baldur's Gate. It's ported somewhat directly from the tabletop version of the spell, but they added a bunch of conditions to make it even worse, and of course in tabletop it's a terrible spell. Circle of Death is a 6th level necromancy spell that does 8d6 of necrotic damage with a con save for half. 8d6, you'll notice, is exactly the same amount of damage as a fireball, a 3rd level spell, and con saves are worse to target than dex saves, so we're looking at doing the same damage as a 3rd level spell with a 6th level spell. The main thing that this spell gets is a gigantic radius, so you can hit, it's a 30-foot radius, which is more than double the size of a fireball in Baldur's Gate, although still significantly smaller than the 60-foot radius that it has in tabletop. However, it also comes with a targeting restriction that was added inexplicably that doesn't exist in the tabletop version of the spell, but does exist in Baldur's Gate. You have to actually target a creature with it, and so the radius is only around that creature. It also will hit allies, so in order to not hit yourself with this spell, thanks to the 30-foot radius, you need to be more than 30 feet away from the creature you're targeting, or you're going to hit yourself. And of course, it's very, very difficult, thanks to the restricted targeting and the giant AoE, not to hit allies with this spell. Not that you'll care, because it doesn't do enough damage for your allies actually to suffer from it regardless, but since it does so little damage, of course the enemies are going to ignore it as well. This spell, the numbers are bad, and conceptually it's bad. It is just a nonsensically terrible spell that honestly I am baffled as to how it made it into the game in its current state. Every change they made from the tabletop version of the spell was to make it worse, and it's already a spell that is only designed to be cast by enemies in tabletop, not by allies. So the use for this spell in tabletop, right, is to show that how bad a dude your big evil villain is by having them cast this giant circle of death and kill, you know, everyone in a town square or a village or whatever who have very low hit points because they're all 1st level commoners, and not big bad adventurers. This isn't a spell that's designed to be used for actual combat between the party and the villain. It's designed for narrative purposes to show how evil the villain is by killing a bunch of civilians. This isn't a spell that you would ever cast as a player, except in certain evil campaigns in tabletop. And so they've not only directly ported that sort of narrative-only spell from tabletop to Baldur's Gate, but also made it worse and harder to use. Just a very odd set of decisions, to be honest, and obviously you should never cast this spell. D tier. Even when you're getting it for free with the Staff of Cherished Necromancy bug, still just a bad spell to use, so don't bother. Create Undead. Create Undead is a necromancy summon available to clerics, warlocks, and wizards as a 6th level spell, but not sorcerers, only wizards. Though wizards do have to learn it from leveling up rather than from a scroll, because there are no scrolls of this spell extant in the game. So that means you have to actually be an 11th level cleric, warlock, or wizard in order to cast this spell. Wizards and clerics have to compare this spell, of course, to the other 6th level spell slot summons, the Myrmidons from Conjure Elemental and the Planar Allies, because they will always have access to those if they have access to this. Given that, we have to judge whether the mummy that this spell summons is as good as the best of those in order to determine how often it's going to be useful for clerics and wizards, though warlocks who get this spell and no other 6th level spell summons have much more interest in casting this spell. Create Undead creates a mummy who does 5d6 plus 3 bludgeoning damage with its normal attack, and can attack twice if the thing is frightened. It also has a gaze attack that uses its action that can just frighten an enemy, but the save DC on that is not very high, so it's not that likely to succeed. But if you have frightened from another source, you can get multiple attacks out of the mummy. Because it's an undead, it's difficult to heal as well, which is a drawback, especially for a very expensive summon like this one. And it only has 12 AC, which means that it is very likely to take hits, even though it has 110 HP. The damage on this guy is pretty good, honestly, for the mummy, which is the kind of saving grace of this spell. Its attack is not super likely to hit, but when it does hit, it does pretty good damage, and if you frighten an enemy in some other way, you can have your mummy beat them up and do 10d6 of damage in a single round, which for something that doesn't take a resource after casting this spell is pretty good. All the summon spells are always worth looking at, but the question basically is how does it stack up against the other summons, and I would say, generally speaking, not well. For a tank and damage dealer, you're better off with the Deva. For utility, all of the elemental Myrmidons, I think, are better than the mummy, and its disabling effect is both something a lot of enemies will be immune to, and the save DC on it is very low, so it's not going to succeed that often. I think, in general, outside of themed builds, you are going to want to avoid taking Create Undead on wizards or warlocks, or wizards or clerics, because they have access to way better summons. For warlocks who don't get access to the better summons, this is significantly more usable, because just having access to any summon at all is extremely powerful, and so taking this as your level 6 Mystic Arcanum is going to be pretty solid for warlocks, because you don't have access to any other 6th level summon, and this is an extremely powerful effect that lasts you all day. You don't have anything else you really want to spend that spell on anyways, because the level 6 Mystic Arcanums for warlocks are all bad other than this. So for warlocks in particular, I would bump this up to A tier, but I think overall its terms of general usage is going to put it in B tier. Still totally usable and castable and good for some themed builds, but overall the weakest of the summons, I think, and one that you're going to want to use irregularly, but still sometimes. Disintegrate. Disintegrate is one of the most iconic spells in Dungeons & Dragons. It is a damage spell, 30-foot range, with a dexterity save that completely negates the damage, and it does 10d6 plus 40 force damage. Now, force damage is great. 10d6 plus 40 is 75 force damage. Force damage is the best damage type in general in the game, because almost nothing resists it, and some enemies are vulnerable to it. But is 75 damage enough to justify using a 6th level spell slot? When I'm casting a damage spell with a 6th level spell slot, generally I want to be completely removing an enemy from the game. And 75 average damage, maximum of 100, is just not enough damage to do that against most enemies. This also has the problem of having a dexterity save that completely negates the damage, and when you're casting a 6th level spell, you really do not want to be in a position where an enemy passing the save means that your spell did literally nothing. You don't even get half damage if they pass the save. So this spell has some significant drawbacks that hold it back. It's a pure damage spell that isn't really that much damage. It's a lot of damage, but not so much that it is going to completely obliterate certain enemies, unlike, for example, Chain Lightning. And it has a saving throw that completely negates your action. It's also only 30-foot range, which really is a limitation, especially in the late-game combats, where enemies are very mobile, and the arenas tend to be quite large, so it's actually more difficult to get within 30 feet consistently to land this spell. This spell does have one saving grace, which is that there's a few enemies in the game who are vulnerable to force damage, and objects and stuff are vulnerable to force damage. So if you really, really need to kill an enemy who's vulnerable to force damage, Disintegrate is very good, and as a result, and the enemies that are vulnerable are ones that have weak dexterity saving throws in general. So as a result, Disintegrate does have some uses in those specific encounters. Generally speaking, it's not one that I would regularly cast because it's a pure damage spell, negated completely by enemies passing their saves, and isn't even that much damage if it succeeds. But the existence of enemies who are vulnerable to force damage, I think, does bump it up to C tier. Eyebite. Eyebite is one of my favorite spells, so right away I'm going to admit to some bias here because I think this is an awesome spell that's fun to use, but the question we're answering isn't is it fun to use, it's is it any good? Eyebite is a 10-turn long concentration-based self-buff, but the form that the self-buff takes is in giving you attacks, or an action that you can use to recast one of 3 debuffs every turn as long as you're concentrating on Eyebite. In order to cast it the first time, you need to have an enemy to target with one of these debuffs, so, but unlike other self-buffing spells, that doesn't matter that much, because if you were casting Eyebite, then the action you would want to take in combat would be cast Eyebite, so it's not like it's costing you action economy to need to cast this only while starting a combat rather than casting it ahead of time. As long as you maintain concentration on Eyebite, you can recast it for one of 3 modes, each of which inflicts a pretty crippling debuff, and these debuffs stack, and you can hit them on different enemies or on the same enemy, can have multiple of them as long as you can keep hitting them with Eyebite, and they keep failing their saves. These debuffs are Panicked, which inflicts the Fearful condition. Notably, Fearful is a different condition from Frightened, Terrified, or Feared in Baldur's Gate. Fearful is the one from the level 3 spell Fear that makes enemies run away and they are unable to take actions, which is probably the second most crippling condition to inflict in the game, the first being Paralyzed. But Fearful, is one of the most devastating because the enemies can't do anything and they can't be broken out of it by taking damage. Allies can't help them out of it. The only way they can break out of it is if they get out of your line of sight and then subsequently pass another wisdom save. Another option is Sickened, which targets Constitution rather than Wisdom and gives them disadvantage on attack rolls and skill checks, not saving throws, but skill checks. So disadvantage on attack rolls is a pretty powerful debuff, but significantly less powerful than Fearful, so you'd usually rather go for Fearful. And the third option is Asleep, which puts them to sleep, completely disabling them and removing them from combat, but their allies can wake them up with a shove or help action, and they'll wake up if they subsequently take any damage. So of the 3, the Fearful condition is by far the most powerful, and usually you're going to be using Eyebite Panicked every time you use it. Being able to pass out these debuffs every turn for a long combat is going to be pretty powerful. These are all debuffs. They last 10 turns, so unlike most other debuffing spells in Baldur's Gate, they will last the entire duration of even the longest combat, because they all last 10 turns. And as long as you maintain concentration on the spell, enemies will be afflicted by every one of these conditions that you've passed out. This means that you can stack it on multiple enemies turn after turn, or the same enemy can be afflicted by multiple debuffs as long as you keep recasting Eyebite on them, basically removing some number of enemies from combat every single turn of combat if they keep failing the saves. Notably also, because this is just an action that you take and you can recast it for free without spending a spell slot, if you are hasted or have some other form of additional actions, you can use multiple Eyebites in the same turn. So if you're hasted and cast Eyebite, you can immediately hit 2 enemies with Fearful, or you can hit 1 enemy with Fearful and Sickened or whatever, passing out tons of debuffs over the course of long combats. The fact that these debuffs last as long as you maintain concentration on Eyebite, enemies do not get subsequent saves against them, so if they fail the first save, that's it, and it's some of the most potent debuffs in the game, mostly Fearful, gives Eyebite, I would say, a pretty solid usage in terms of a control spell, and is going to single-handedly win most combats that you cast it in, provided enemies aren't immune to its effects, which is what you want out of a 6th level spell, right? You want to cast these 6th level spells and have them just win the fight. There are a lot of fights where it won't be useful, because enemies will be immune to Fearful, or there will just be too many enemies for you to hit a significant number of them with Eyebite, but for the fights where this spell is good, I think it is quite good, and even if you have a party that's designed to end fights quickly, Eyebite is a way to knock out enemies who you otherwise wouldn't be able to kill quickly. The number of immunities to this spell by the time you reach this point in the game does restrict its use, so I'm going to put it in, I think, B tier, but I think this spell is slept on, pardon the pun, by the community, and is generally quite powerful, and one that you should look at to solve certain encounters in the late game once you get access to this spell. Just the ability to have enemies every single turn have to roll a die or instantly lose the combat is really, really powerful, so even though it's restricted in its use, when you do get to use it, it's awesome. Flesh to Stone. Flesh to Stone, is a Constitution save debuff that restrains an enemy, so hits them with the restrained effect where they can't move and have disadvantage on stuff, and you have advantage on attacking them, if they fail a con save. And then at the beginning of each of their turns, they get an additional Constitution save to break out of the effect. If they then fail it, they progress to the next stage, which is still restrained, and if they then fail that one, they progress to the next stage, which is still restrained, and if they then fail a 4th con save in a row, they turn to stone and instantly die, basically. They become a statue and are gone from combat. This is a con save to inflict a condition that you can inflict with a level 1 spell in an AoE, and it's a concentration spell that requires enemies to fail 4 saves in a row in order to die. I think you can probably guess where I'm going to put this one. Obviously, it's funny to turn your enemies into a statue, but it is not useful to cast this spell in combat. D tier. Globe of Invulnerability. Globe of Invulnerability is a 3-turn duration ground cast spell, so it makes a small radius on the ground, 10-foot radius, and within that radius, everything in the radius is completely immune to all damage. It uses the same description as Otiluke's Resilient Sphere, but unlike Otiluke's Resilient Sphere, actually does the thing that the description says. It just makes everything inside it immune to damage. No damage can affect creatures inside it, including both allies and enemies, but spells can be targeted through the wall, no problem. Things on the ground or things attacking you from within the globe will still not do any damage to you, but any crowd control effects that are applied through the walls of the globe are just fine. Creatures can move through the walls of the globe just fine. Ground targeting or ground effects like grease or ice surfaces will still knock you over, and so on. It just makes everything in it completely immune to damage. This makes you unlikely, though it's not impossible, to lose concentration on it, because the most common way to lose concentration on something is to take damage and have to make a con save, but since you are immune to damage when you're inside your own globe, you can't take damage and therefore won't have to make concentration saves most of the time. However, if an enemy hits you with a control spell or knocks you prone, you'll still lose concentration on the globe. Globe of Invulnerability makes you perfectly immune to environmental damage as well, so you can basically completely ignore all of the arenas that do damage to you. It also makes you immune to, cheesy effects like your own gigantic barrel explosions, and so on. most of the critical boss fights in the game are going to be 3 turns of them pouring tons of damage at you, and Globe of Invulnerability completely counters that effect. I've said before that what I want from a 6th level spell is for it to just win the encounter on its own, and Globe of Invulnerability wins a lot of encounters on its own. Yes, enemies can get in there with you and become immune to damage. Yes, enemies can technically push you out of the globe and then attack you, but in my experience, they don't do that. And in a tabletop version of this spell would be significantly worse, because smart enemies would do their best to get you out of the globe. Since Baldur's Gate enemies mostly do not do that, in my experience, then though enemy AI does get consistently updated, so that may change at some point. The globe is basically perfect protection from all damage in some of the most dangerous encounters in the game. And like I said, a lot of the most dangerous encounters in the game are just, can you either kill them before they do any of their damage or survive the damage they're outputting? Globe of Invulnerability just wins those encounters outright. For basically every sorcerer and wizard, I think having a spell in your back pocket that just immediately wins the encounter outright is going to be an incredibly powerful effect. It's also worth noting that at 6th level spell, it's not competing with too many other encounter-winning effects, so Globe of Invulnerability is one that you are very likely to want to invest in somewhere in your party, because it's going to help you win some of the hardest encounters in the game completely on its own. And you can just sit in there firing your spells off. You can also leave, make a melee attack, leave on your turn, make a melee attack, and then re-enter the globe. So it's not only useful for spellcasters and ranged attackers. As long as you have reasonable mobility on your melee characters, you can continue to benefit from it just by leaving and re-entering. The sort of fortress style of play is extremely powerful. You can combine it with darkness to make your characters untargetable from outside, although that will sometimes make the enemies walk in there with you, which you don't want, because then they'll become immune to immune to damage themselves. But in general, this is so good at winning so many encounters, and the encounters that it wins are some of the hardest encounters in the game otherwise. I think that every character who has access to this spell should take it, and I'm going to place it in S tier. You will not cast it every adventuring day, but the adventuring days that you do, it's going to win the hardest encounters there, and so I think it would be a mistake not to have access to this spell in your party. Harm. Harm is a 60-foot range damage spell, 14d6 damage with a con save for half. 14d6 is, I want to say, 49 damage on average. 10d6 is 35, so 14d6 is 49, yeah. So it is a very small amount of damage for a level 6 spell slot with a con save for half, but it reduces enemy maximum hit points by the damage they take. That doesn't matter. Enemy healing is not really a thing that you have to worry about. If they spend their turn healing, great, and all the enemies that do heal a lot are enemies who are resistant or immune to necrotic damage or resistant or immune to diseases anyways. So already this spell is bad, but it gets worse because this spell cannot reduce enemies below 1 hit point. That's right, it is a damage spell that can't kill things. I mean, come on, do I have to say more than that? It's a damage spell that can't kill things. D tier. Heal. Heal is a healing spell that has 60-foot range and heals for 70, as well as removing any blindness and diseases. And that's 70 flat. It's just always exactly 70 hit points, which means it's extremely reliable. And I do like things that are reliable and don't require you to roll dice. Healing in general in Baldur's Gate is not a powerful strategy because it is reactive rather than proactive. You're better off preventing the damage rather than healing it after it's been done. And enemy damage is just going to outpace the numbers on most healing effects that you have access to in the game regardless. That being said, 70 healing on a spell means it's basically going to bring just about any character back to full hit points. So almost always when you cast a spell, it's going to be a full heal for a character, bringing them back from whatever they're at to their maximum hit point total. That's okay. I mean, that is an effect that you might want sometimes, the just full healing an ally, but it's at the cost of your 6th level spell. So how often is that going to be the right thing to do in an encounter? Very, very rarely, I would say. It's probably not 0 that this is the tactically optimal decision to cast, but I think it basically is 0 that it's the tactically optimal decision to have prepared. So unless you're a character that gets this from an item or gets it for free somehow, there just isn't any reason to have prepared this spell on your cleric or druid, and so you're just not going to end up casting it because you won't have brought it to the fight. There are maybe some times where if you did have it prepared, it would be right to cast it, because a full heal can sometimes be valuable, but generally speaking, you are just not going to want to take this compared to other 6th level spells, and I'm going to rate it D tier. Hero's Feast. Hero's Feast is a buff spell available to druids and clerics that buffs your entire party because it's a gigantic AoE, so you can hit everyone in your camp even if they're not in your active party very easily. So even though the NPCs will run off sometimes and be hard to hit with buff spells, you can hit your whole camp with it, and it gives them the thoroughly stuffed condition, which I'm sure, once again, we can all be very mature about in the comments. And what that does is make them immune to poison, disease, and frightened, increase their maximum hit points by 12, and this is an increase to their base maximum hit points, so it can be repaired by healing spells. You get half of it back when you short rest, and it stacks with other sources of temporary hit points. It also stacks with the maximum hit point increases given by the aid spell, so you can have both of those running at once for a significant buff to your whole max hit point, to all of your max hit points. And you make all wisdom saves with advantage. This lasts for your whole party. As a day-long non-concentration buff, I would be remiss not to mention that the best way to get this spell is from a camp follower, a character who's not part of your active party can cast this and then stay home, while the rest of your party goes out on adventures with this buff. But the question, of course, is it worth it to cast as a spell from your active party where you're actually expending a resource to cast this spell? The immunities that it gives you are excellent. Immune to poison, disease, and frightened. They aren't the most difficult to come by immunities in the game, but getting them all at once on your whole party is somewhat difficult, and there are a lot of encounters where these effects will come up. Immune to poisoned also allows you to do a bunch of things with your own spells, like you can stand in your own cloud kills, for example, safely, meaning that it opens up a bunch of tactical options that you wouldn't otherwise have. 12 extra maximum hit points is not a huge deal, but is nice to have, especially because you can you can short rest to gain them back, you can heal it back. But the big one here is advantage on wisdom saving throws. Advantage on wisdom saves for the whole day is extremely powerful because wisdom saves are generally the most debilitating effects in the game, and when combined with the pile of immunities it gives you, immune to frightened, it means that you are much, much less likely to be hit by these cripplingly dangerous crowd control effects that can sometimes afflict your party. Altogether, this is a really nice package of buffs that you get to precast. It lasts for the entire day, so I have mentioned previously that my sort of criteria for a 6th level spell is, does it win one encounter on its own, or does it make it significantly easier to win every encounter for the whole day? And the answer for this is because it's a buff that doesn't take an action, and it lasts all day, doesn't take your concentration, the only resource it takes is the spell slot to cast it. It makes it significantly easier for you to have a long and productive adventuring day where you are immune to a whole bunch of dangerous effects, much less likely to be hit by a crowd control effect. It makes you significantly safer throughout the day. Are you going to cast this at the beginning of every day of adventuring? Maybe, maybe not. There are some other day-long buffs that are really good, like the summons. Druids, for example, are probably better off with an Elemental Myrmidon as their day-long buff from a 6th level spell, but Hero's Feast is also incredibly powerful as a day-long buff, and of course it gets better the more summons you have, so that's another point in its favor, because it affects all your summons as well. Just like Aid, it's a massive multiplier if you are a necromancer or a spore druid who's got zombies or skeletons running around. It's going to multiply all their hit points as well as giving them all the immunities, although many of them already have those immunities, but still just an enormous buff to your whole party and all your summons, your familiars, your animal companions, whatever you might have. Even without a whole bunch of summons running around, I think this spell is very, very important. It's one of the reasons to go to level 11 in Cleric or Druid, because it's just that powerful. It is, I think, an extremely valuable spell that you will use for a lot of Act 3 to great effect. You probably won't cast it every single adventuring day, but the adventuring days you do, it will be extremely important, and the things that it's competing against are not so powerful that you would be wrong to just cast it every adventuring day. It costs your 6th level spell slot, but it gives you a bunch of return on that. I think it would be a mistake to place this anywhere other than S tier, even though, much like Globe of Invulnerability, you won't use it for every encounter, but some of the hardest encounters in the game, this wins on its own, and also it gives you a nice boost for every other encounter that day. I really like Hero's Feast and highly recommend that you use it frequently. S tier spell, moving on. Otiluke's Freezing Sphere. Otiluke's Freezing Sphere is a spell that is basically a nuke. It's basically a fireball. It's cast like Produce Flame, where you cast it and then you have the thing in your inventory and you can throw it either with that same action or with a later action, but since it only lasts for 10 turns before it explodes, it's not like you can cast it at the beginning of the day. You basically have to use it the turn you're planning to, and it still takes an action to launch it, so it doesn't save you action economy to precast it, so you can just think of it pretty much as a fireball. But it's an ice ball, which in Baldur's Gate is significantly better than a fireball, because it does 10d6 of cold damage, averaging 35 cold damage with a constitution save for half, and that 10d6 of cold damage can, of course, be doubled by the wet condition, meaning that it can often be 70 average cold damage. It's a 20-foot radius explosion with a 20-foot radius ice surface that it leaves on the ground, and ice surfaces are, of course, incredibly powerful, but a 20-foot radius ice surface as an instant cast spell sounds kind of familiar to me because the spell Ice Storm does exactly the same thing. Ice Storm is a 4th level spell that does 4d6 of cold damage, 2d8 bludgeoning, so it's less damage and some of it's bludgeoning, so you can't double that damage, but it's 2 whole spell levels lower and doesn't have to be thrown in a straight line. It comes down from above, so you don't need the same line of sight to cast Ice Storm. And since either way, the best thing that you're getting out of these spells is the giant ice surface, I don't really see a use case for Freezing Sphere as long as Ice Storm exists. They're both wizard spells, so any character that has access to Freezing Sphere will have access to Ice Storm. And the fact that you can hold on to it in your inventory or pass it to an ally doesn't really mean anything, because it still takes an action to use after you've cast it, so you don't get any action economy from precasting the spell. It's basically just Ice Storm for a little more damage, but a higher level. Is it worth the extra damage to cast this as a 6th level spell? I just don't think so. The amount of damage that you get from the spell is not significantly is not higher enough than the amount of damage you get from Ice Storm to justify casting this over casting Ice Storm. One thing that I haven't tested, if someone wants to test this in the comments, test this and let me know in the comments, is because it lasts for 10 turns and then explodes. If you reverse pickpocket it into someone's inventory, I guess you could have it explode in their inventory, which would be very funny, but isn't, I don't think, a use case that's worth mentioning, that's worth actually going out of your way to cast this spell for. This isn't a bad spell, I should emphasize this. Considered in isolation, this spell is actually pretty good. 35 cold damage, possibly doubled to 70 with a giant ice surface that knocks a bunch of enemies over, is a reasonably powerful effect, but you can't consider it purely in isolation. The existence of Ice Storm and, of course, the existence of Sleet Storm at 3rd level, which you have to consider when you're considering Ice Storm, just fully overpowers this spell, and there's just no reason to cast this spell when the lower leveled version exists. D tier spell for that reason, though it's worth mentioning that this just isn't a bad spell on its own, but there are just options that do exactly the same thing at lower levels. Otto's Irresistible Dance. This is a level 11 Bard and Wizard spell that causes an enemy to be unable to attack or to take actions or move, and if you attack it, you have advantage on attack rolls. So it is an extremely powerful disable. It's one of the most debilitating conditions in the game. The only better one is Paralyzed, but this is pretty darn close. And it's a 10-turn concentration targeted on a single creature, but the thing that makes Otto's Irresistible Dance unique is that they don't get a saving throw when you first cast the spell. This will always trade your action for at least one action from the enemy. They always skip their first turn. It's irresistible, because it's the irresistible dance, and they don't get a save until the end of their next turn, and the timing rules do work properly on this spell, to be able to break out of it. So you're always getting to trade at least your action for their action. Now, enemies have some powerful abilities that aren't actions, which they can sometimes still do, but for mostly Otto's Irresistible Dance is basically trading a 6th level spell and your turn for at least one enemy turn, and possibly multiple enemy turns if they continue to fail the saves, as well as giving you advantage on all your attack rolls against them, which by this point in the game you probably have other sources of advantage, but is pretty nice, and they're unable to move, so you can trap them in damaging or dangerous effects, and so on. This is an extremely powerful way to shut down bosses. It also, very few, it does count as a charmed effect, so some enemies are immune to charm and will not be able to be targeted by this, but fewer than you'd think are immune to charm in Baldur's Gate, and so you actually can land this on some even extremely dangerous bosses that you would think would be immune to charming effects, are not immune to autos, and you can stop them from acting with this spell. The ability to, without any saving throws, trade your action for your opponent's action is very powerful. And while I wouldn't say that this is the most powerful spell in your average encounter, the fact that it lets you just fully take a boss out of the encounter completely for at least one turn and possibly more is pretty good. Now, the question, of course, is, would you cast this when Hold Person exists? Would you cast this when Command exists? And the answer is, yeah, sometimes you would, because sometimes it's just that important that the enemy fails or doesn't get their first saving throw, and so casting this spell is very good in certain boss encounters, where if they even get a single turn, you could be in trouble. Remember, you can cast this and then layer other disables on it, so you can cast it to make them skip a turn, and then you get a full turn to cast Ice Surfaces, Hunger of Hadar, Wall of Thorns, and so on, that can plant growth, etc., that can keep the enemy in place and unable to act for future turns, even if they break out of the Irresistible Dance, and they're not guaranteed to, they just get to make a save at the end of their turn to see if they break out of it. Very, very powerful debuff, and anything that you don't have to roll for is always worth looking at in D&D. Always extremely powerful to have an option that just works 100% of the time. As I say many times, the enemy of optimization is randomness, and this is one of the least random spells in D&D because it is irresistible. I will place it in A tier because I don't think it's required for like every character that has access to it, and it's not going to there are only some encounters where it's extremely powerful in, but the encounters where it's good in, it's very good in, and it's always worth looking at, is this the best thing that I can spend my 6th level slot and my turn on? And the answer is often enough yes, that I think it's an A tier spell. Planar Ally. Planar Ally is another day-long summon spell at 6th level, available only to clerics. And as a 6th level cleric summon, you have to compare it to Create Undead, because while you can have both of these at once, you won't have two 6th level spell slots most of the time to get both of them summoned at once. And you also have to compare it to Hero's Feast. These are all day-long non-concentration buffs for your party that your clerics are spending their 6th level spell slot on, so you are usually going to be choosing between Planar Ally, Create Undead, and Hero's Feast as your 6th level spell slot of choice for a cleric in your party. This is a modal spell, so it has 3 different options, each of which can summon 3 different creatures. You can either summon a Jinni, a Deva, or a Cambion. And basically, if you want a little more tanking and control, you summon the Jinni. If you want more damage, you summon the Deva, and if you want to be sad, you summon the Cambion. The Cambion's numbers just do not keep up to the other two, so I would never recommend summoning the Cambion. It has very low melee damage, worse AC, worse hit points, and it's Rays of Frost, it's got Rays of Fire, it's got a kind of souped up Ray of Fire, souped up Scorching Ray, uses its Charisma to hit, so it is rolling only on a +6 to hit with the Scorching Rays, meaning they will almost never succeed, so you are basically never going to get good value out of the Cambion compared to the other 2 options. You can summon the Deva, which does way more damage than the other options, just its melee attacks and its smites are really good, and it's pretty tanky with 21 AC and 136 hit points. It's going to survive pretty well. Or the Jinni has 160 plus hit points, pretty solid saving throws, 19 AC, so worse than the Deva, but is, I think, slightly more survivable overall just because of the increased hit points, and also gives you a push and a pull with its Thunder Wave and Drunken Inhale abilities, as well as a ground targeting effect that can cause enemies to be restrained. Now, the restrained is only on a DC 15. Most things aren't going to fail on that, but restrained is a very powerful condition, so it is something that is worth keeping in mind. Generally, of these three, I think that generically speaking, the Deva is the best, but the Jinni is very, very close and could be used for certain party comps, and is also very good, and the Cambion is terrible. Overall, I think that Planar Ally, considered as a summon, either the Jinni or the Deva are better than the Mummy. So it's one, if you're considering between those two summons, you are going to want Planar Ally. I think that most of the time you're better off just with the Hero's Feast buff, but this is still a good spell that's going to be quite powerful throughout the game and give you, or throughout the day, give you a bunch of additional options. Also notable that these characters are healable unlike the Mummy, so you can restore their hit points, so these summons are very effective and will give you a lot of additional damage, as well as, of course, tanking, blocking doorways, and so on, all the great things that you can normally do with summons. Once again, these are good enough summons that they're worth summoning only for a single encounter, even if you don't want to drag them from encounter to encounter, and so that makes them a pretty solid spell choice, but the fact that they are competing against Hero's Feast, and, of course, in terms of if you just want like a single summon for your party, they definitely do not compare well to the elemental myrmidons available to the other classes. They won't be directly competing against those, but they are worse summons than those. I think these are a nice solid summon that you will never be unhappy to cast, and I'm going to put it in A tier, but it is not as broken as some of the other summoning spells in the game. Sunbeam. Sunbeam is a nuke. It's a beam spell that is 60 foot in range, so it's not as long range as Lightning Bolt, but uses the same attack pattern. It fires in a straight line and does 6d8 of radiant damage, which is not very much for this level, with a Constitution save for half damage, and if they fail the con save, they are also blinded. The important thing about this spell, though, is that you can then recast it, as long as you maintain concentration on it, using your action to fire it again every turn. This is, again, something that you can do multiple times if you are hasted, so you can double recast Sunbeam, and if for that particular use case, it does a lot of damage, because double casting Sunbeam is pretty good. Now, is that better than any other double action that you would be taking? Maybe not, but on Honor Mode especially, where you won't be getting to multi-attack with your hasted actions, having them be on something like this to double cast Sunbeam, double cast Eyebite, and so on can be reasonably valuable. Is the amount of damage that you're doing with a con save for half and the chance of blinding enemies worth spending a 6th level spell slot on this? The answer is, I would say, sometimes. There are some enemies who are weak to radiant damage who this is good against. Other than that, and if you have a party designed to take advantage of the haste recast, then it is possible to get quite a bit of value out of this spell. Otherwise, you're basically just spending this spell to give you a a medium debuff that's pretty resistible and a very small amount of damage every turn. I think I'm going to put this in C tier because it requires both an enemy who you want to cast this spell over a different combat spell against, so they usually need to be weak to radiant damage in some way, and some of the enemies that are weak to radiant damage can't be blinded also, and you need to usually you're going to want to be able to haste the character that's casting this in order to get maximum value out of it. It's an okay spell and a reasonable nuke in some encounters, but not the most impressive spell in the game. C tier. Hey pals, it's me from the future again. So Wall of Ice is one of the spells that was fixed, at least in part, in patch 6, and so it has changed significantly from its previous state. So I'm re-recording this segment to tell you what it used to do, what it now does, and what it's supposed to do, all three of which are different things. So Wall of Ice is an upgrade to Wall of Stone. It's a wall spell that you place in a line. It has the same targeting issues that other wall spells have, where you need a straight line, and that line can be interrupted even by very small obstructions or height differences, so it's sometimes difficult to place exactly where you want it. However, it can be placed over enemies, and if you do so, it's just going to create a gap in the wall. Similar to Wall of Stone, it creates pillars of ice that have 30 health each, and block line of sight and movement, but in addition to those things, here's what it's supposed to do. It does 10d6 of cold damage on the initial cast, and then if those pillars are broken, it leaves behind a cloud of freezing gas that does 10d6 damage to creatures starting their turn in there. That's what the description claims it does, but not even close to what it actually does. Before patch 6, it did not do the initial damage at all, and if you broke a pillar, it would do 5d6 of damage from the cold damage instead of 10d6. After patch 6, so this is the current state of the spell, it does do the initial 10d6 of damage, but if you break a pillar, it still only does 5d6, not 10d6 as stated in the description. It also creates a large area of ice around the spell, so a giant ice surface. So when you cast the spell, you get 10d6 of cold damage, and a dexterity saving throw for half, but also a dexterity saving throw or enemies will fall over, and then they're stuck in an ice surface. Since this is a large linear wall, this ice surface can pretty easily be used to block up a big chunk of the encounter, so it's a reasonably good use of an ice surface. This spell does require concentration, but importantly, if you break concentration on it, even by canceling manually, all of the pillars count as having been destroyed, leaving the freezing gas behind. So this spell actually, now as implemented in patch 6, has two modes, one as a wall of stone that does some additional damage and knocks enemies over, or two as just a super nuke, because you can cast it on top of an enemy and then immediately cancel concentration on it to get the extra 5d6 of damage. And this 5d6 of damage from the freezing clouds uses the same timing rules as like Cloud of Daggers or whatever, so they take the 5d6 when they enter the area and at the beginning of their turn, meaning it actually does do the 10d6 that is in the description, just not for the reasons that the developers think it does. This spell was extremely buggy and is still extremely buggy, so it's something that you have to consider, but when you cast this spell and then immediately cancel it, it's just a 20d6 cold damage nuke, which you can then double with the wet condition up to 40d6 of cold damage. That's going to be an average of 140 damage. That leaves a cloud in the area that will continue to do damage if you can keep enemies in it or throw them back into it, and leaves an ice surface on the ground. As a modal, as a spell by itself, that would be really good. 40d6 of cold damage plus an ice surface is a lot of damage. That is so much damage. And you have the modal option of just leaving it intact and actually concentrating on it and getting 20d6 of damage plus a wall plus the ice surface, which can really block up encounters. Given that they have fixed the initial damage on this spell, so it's now either one of the best AoE nukes in the game, or a wall plus even still a pretty efficient nuke, this is just a really solid spell that I now recommend taking. So while I previously had it in D tier, I'm going to bump it all the way up to A tier. You'll see it in the wrong place for the rest of the video, just because it was previously super bugged and did not do any of the things that it said. But now, even doing part of what it's supposed to do, this spell is great, and I think is going to be a mainstay going forward. Alright, jumping right back into our previously scheduled programming. Wall of Thorns. Wall of Thorns is another wall spell, so it has the same targeting issues where you have to be able to draw a straight line, and the game is not very generous to the player with that. It is difficult to have it not be blocked by a pillar or a random change in height level or whatever, but even targeting this spell for a small area can still be good if the spell effects are good enough. So the question is, what does it actually do, and is that powerful enough? It basically combines a whole bunch of druid spells all into one. First up, it does 7d8 of piercing damage, which is a weird number, but averages 31.5 damage, I think, per turn, so 1.5 damage less than Blade Barrier. 2 two creatures inside of it. And similar to Blade Barrier or whatever, this is another one where you get to double dip on the damage because they take damage on the initial cast, and then take damage if they start their turn in the spell or enter it, so you can double dip on the damage by shoving enemies back into it or by casting it directly on top of them. 60 odd damage is not like the most amazing for a spell at this level, but is still definitely worth mentioning. It also reduces movement speed within it to 1/4, the same as plant growth, which is an extremely powerful effect, and enough that it will actually sometimes prevent enemies from passing all the way through the wall if they are slowed by some other means or have low movement speed already. And enemies who fail the dexterity save against it become entangled. It's a dex save to have damage, and if they fail it, they become entangled. Interestingly, also, if an enemy teleports out of the spell after having become entangled, they stay entangled. That effect is separate from being inside the wall, so you can continue to debuff them even if they leave or teleport out, or if they get to leave somehow or teleport out of the wall spell, but it also can just immobilize them in the wall spell, in which case you're continuing to do the damage. This is a whole bunch of really solid spells all packed into one package that will continuously do damage, debuff enemies with one of the more brutal conditions in the game. Entangled is a very good condition. Packing this all into a single package is something that I really like, and that I think is an excellent spell. I think this is another one of those day-long druid spells that is, this is a spell that is almost always going to win the encounter in which you cast it if you place it correctly, because it's going to trap enemies inside it and do a whole bunch of damage, and that's exactly what you want out of a 6th level spell. It's competing, of course, in Druid with the 6th level Conjure Elemental and with Hero's Feast, but it is a worthy competitor to those, and in the encounter that you cast it in, Wall of Thorns is going to be incredible. Highly recommend this spell. I'm going to put it in A tier, and I think it's one that you're going to want to cast quite frequently. Just a very good spell overall. Windwalk. This is effectively mass gaseous form. It's exactly the same as gaseous form, but it affects your whole party. You all become clouds of mist and can pass through the little pipes, and also get a whole bunch of irrelevant things because you're not going to use it in combat. You get advantage on some saves and become resistant to damage, but you can't do anything when you're in gaseous form, so you're not going to use the spell in combat or to escape. There are teleport options. This is basically just, do you want to move through the tiny cracks in the world for story reasons, and how often do you need to move your whole party through one of those? Not that often. So generally speaking, this is totally superseded by gaseous form or enlarge reduce or other ways to just pass through those areas. I wouldn't recommend casting Windwalk. It's just basically you're spending a 6th level spell slot to get the advantages of a 3rd level spell, and it's just not something, or a potion or a scroll, all of which are relatively easy to come by as well. And since this is something you're only going to do like once in the game, then you'll definitely have enough scrolls and potions for your whole party if for some reason you need to turn your whole party into gas clouds. So I just wouldn't recommend taking this spell. D tier spell. Future me checking in with a really quick update as well, because we have gotten one additional 6th level spell. This was moved up from 5th level. It's the secret spell, Sights of the Seelie Summon Deva, and that is the version of Planar Ally that only gives you the Deva. This used to be a 5th level wizard spell, and I evaluated it in my 5th level spells tier list, is now a 6th level only wizard spell, and so is going to go down in tier significantly. The Deva is just a worse summon than the Conjure Elemental summons, and it's now competing with those because it's a wizard spell, so it is definitely going to drop significantly in tier. I think it's basically a B tier spell on par with Create Undead, because if you are getting multiple summons in a day by refreshing spell slots, it can still be powerful, and it's not like a bad spell to cast or anything. The Deva's a pretty good summon, but since it's now competing with the Conjure Elemental Myrmidon summons, it's significantly weaker than it was as a 5th level spell. So just a quick update there. Alright, so that's all the 6th level spells. I hope that you've enjoyed this list. 6th level spells, I think, did pretty well out of this. I was honestly expecting to have many fewer in high tiers than I ended up with, but I think that this list is pretty representative of the 6th level spells in general. The ones that are most powerful are the ones that can either have generically super high utility every time you cast them, like Hero's Feast, or the ones that fully win some encounters in the game, like Globe of Invulnerability. And of course, there's a bunch that are just really solid uses of spell slots, like all of the ones in A tier. 6th level spells are a significant investment, and of course are competing with every other spell in the entire game, because you can always upcast a lower level spell using a 6th level spell slot. And I mean, the best use of a 6th level spell is still probably commanding 6 creatures, but the 6th level spells themselves are extremely potent, and the fact that so many of them are powerful day-long buffs for your party does give them an extra dimension of utility that is really powerful. Most of these spells are ones that you're going to want somewhere in your party so that you can end up using them for those options. Of course, as always, there's a bunch of damage spells that don't get there because their numbers aren't good enough, but the utility spells at this level are incredibly strong. Alright, friends, I want to say thank you to everyone who made it this far. This has been a super fun series, getting through every spell tier list. Of course, let me know if there's something you want to move around. And don't worry, this is not the end of this series. I have promised you also a corrections video for, or a rebuttal video, I guess, basically, for the tier 2 spells, where there's a spell I really want to dive into that I think is being somewhat misevaluated by the community, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a future video. And I also intend to do a roundup for every tier list where we go over them and talk about general principles for how to choose spells and which ones are worth upcasting and so on. That's been a pretty common request. So there's a little more of these tier lists to come. We'll do a major summary video as well as another feedback list. Let me know also what you'd like to see next after this. A few people have mentioned an illicit power tier list, and that's one I'm definitely interested in doing. But if there's anything else you want to see me do a deep dive on, like we did with the spells and feats and skills and so on, definitely let me know. Always open to suggestions. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this video, and as always, of course, feel free to leave a comment and like the video. This one is definitely one of the ones that it's nice to do that with, because this is one of the ways to bring in new viewers to the channel. Is tier lists like this is a good way. They have like lots of mass appeal, and you know, people feel strongly about them, so it's a good way to bring in new people. So that helps me out a ton if you take the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel, and if you feel like this stuff has been helpful, you know, you can give me some money. And I really appreciate it when people do that with the join or thanks buttons below. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.